philosophy, which is an affirmation or a mutation rather than a negation, we could speak of unlearning as non-pedagogy. Nobody gets left behind here. The we Halberstam interpolates is crucial. Laura Berlant concludes sex or the unbearable with a gesture to the ways in which failure to understand can be generative of new modes of being together, relationality and sociality. She says, I do not read things, I read with things. When I read with theorists, with art, with a colleague or a friend, to read with is to cultivate a quality of attention to the disturbance of their alien epistemology, an experience of non-sovereignty that shakes my confidence in a way from which I have learned to derive pleasure, induce attachment, and maintain curiosity about the enigmas and insecurities that I can bear understand or comprehend. This is what it means to say that excitement is disturbing, not devastating, ambivalent, not shattering in the extreme. Structural consistency is a fantasy. The noise of relations impact, inducing incompletion where it emerges, is the overwhelming condition that enables the change that within collaborative action can shift lived worlds.
Final proposition, proposition 3. Ignorance does not mean failure. Example, interview with Orson Welles, BBC, 1960. Interviewer, where did you get the confidence to make Citizen Kane, Orson? Wells, ignorance, sheer ignorance. You know, there's no confidence to equal it. It's only when you know something about a profession, I think, that you're timid or careful. Interviewer, how does this ignorance show itself? Wells, I thought you could do anything with a camera that the eye could do, that the imagination could do. And if you come up from the bottom of the film business, you're taught all the things that the cameraman shouldn't attempt for fear you might be criticised for having failed. And in this case, I had a cameraman who didn't care if he was criticised, if he failed. And I didn't know there were things you couldn't do. So anything I could think up in my dreams, I attempted to photograph, not knowing that they were impossible, or theoretically impossible. And again, I had a real advantage, not only in a real genius of a cameraman, but in the fact he, like all great men, I think, who are masters of their craft, told me right from the start, there was nothing about camera work that I couldn't learn in half a day, that any intelligent person couldn't learn in half a day. And he was right. The great mystery that requires 20 years doesn't exist in any field, certainly not for the camera. Learning from these extracts means learning from the event, and we emphasize the word about here. It means learning about the event's openness to futurity, to come, to a radical avenir, a radical hermeneutics resistant to the dogmatic slumber of acquired, required understanding, the tyranny of institutionalization, and the concept of winning at all costs, of excellence over thought. The eventness of the event, our failure to pin it down, and in the here and now, like a Zeno paradox, ensures that we are, as ever, alive to the trace of learning in the living time of learning, which is also a mode of unlearning. In this, unlearning signifies the renewal of understanding in terms of what Schlegel called Unverständlichkeit and ununderstandability at the beating heart of each and every enunciation, its performativity, or more justly, its performativity.
Or, since we are talking about or around the eventness of the event, let's even more justly call it performativity.
If quotidian scenes of teaching and learning instruct us experientially, they do so by constantly renewing and emphasizing singularity and unexpectedness. It is what, we wager, constitutes the most intense form of learning, unlearning.
Speaking of wagering, Deborah Britzman, in The Very Thought of Education, writes that to become what we have never been is to wager our craft along with the obsessions that express, without qualification, a gigantic measure of our ignorance. Vulnerable to error and accidents and subject to radical indeterminacy, we wager our ignorance against the subject supposed to know.
Here also terminological distinctions are simply untenable. To repeat, learning is and is not unlearning, and vice versa, like Freud's failed attempts to separate the Heimlich and unheimlich. This is not a rational tautology, I know, but it is a necessary one. To put it simply, unlearning is not an anthem of learning. Unlearning, stupidity and ignorance are not quite the same thing either. If there is a law applicable to the concept, non-concept of unlearning, then it is simply this: that in teaching, you can never be sure what you are teaching or precisely what effect you are having on your students, or when that effect will manifest itself, when it will return, how it will return, from where it will return.
As Avital Ronell unpacks it, the teaching scene is ide-pedagogical. arse backwards or arse upwards, a dildo-logical pedagogy where no one knows where and when teaching will arrive or have arrived. We let it come about. So, more justly than even before, we might say that the event of unlearning is meta-peri-performative. As Hamaker would put it, we gather around the suspension of all knowledge. Hamaker says, it is only this suspension which is between us and out of which we become we.
Importantly, this does not absolve us from our responsibilities. In fact, it intensifies them, hyperbolizes them. Knowing not what you do is no excuse for not knowing that what you do often has far-reaching consequences. The task is to know that this is the case and to try as far as possible to keep thinking, to open debate, to make thinking the locus of learning. We'll finish with this thought from Bill Readings in the hope that it might open up to something like what we're trying to say here. Contrary to conventional wisdom, says Readings in the University in Runes, an audience does not pre-exist an event. The event makes the audience happen, rather than the event happening in front of an audience. Making an audience for this kind of pedagogy happen is the task that faces those of us who find ourselves in the contemporary university. Teachers and students alike, creating and addressing such an audience will not revitalise the university or solve all our problems. It will, however, allow the exploration of differences in ways that are liberating to the extent that they assume nothing in advance.
If we knew what was coming in the teaching situation, then the very eventness of the event would be shut off, foreclosed, annulled. Weak pedagogy is democratic in Rancier's and Sam Chambers' terms, insofar as it is hospitable to that which arrives without calculation, conditions, or programme. A weak pedagogy is, in a sense, meta-performative, a letting come of what will come, a letting come of the other, a meta-pedagogics. In opening up to the event of teaching, the subject supposed to know self-shatters, acknowledging her ignorance, failure, stupidity in a perverse love of unlearning. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick once said, ignorance is as potent and multiple a thing as knowledge, and that learning often takes place completely independently of teaching. A perverse pedagogics avows that failure to know is constitutive of the scene of teaching. Teaching is a passion for the impossible, a suspension of knowledge in and as the event of learning. If weak thinking is love, then the risky event of teaching beyond knowledge is a pervo-philo-pedagogics which we cannot but be in love with, because that is all that really matters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Katie Gannan will come up and introduce our next speaker, and we get underway properly.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to warmly welcome our first speaker of the day, Jack Halberstam, who's a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Gender Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. Jack's work is focused on areas of popular visual and queer culture, with an emphasis on subcultures. His 1998 book, Female Masculinity, made a groundbreaking argument about non-male masculinity. In 2005, his book on queer time and place, transgender bodies, subcultural lives was published, describing and theorizing queer reconfigurations of time and space in relation to subcultural scenes and the emergence of transgender visibility. Most recently, and not without controversy, Jack wrote a piece entitled "You're Triggering Me, the neoliberal rhetoric of harm, danger and trauma." And today, Jack's paper is entitled "A Path So Twisted, Thinking Widely and Through Punk Feminism." Thank you, Jack.
From this distance, it does not, right? Yes, it does. There we go. All right. What is this? This is interesting. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. Eamon said now we'll begin properly. I'm not sure we will. Hopefully we'll begin a little improperly. I'm not sure if it'll be para or meta performative, but we will we'll find out. I'm very excited to be here. I have thought a lot about pedagogy, unlearning, the power of stupidity and ignorance and unknowing, and that was sort of the focus in the queer art of failure. That's just a little meme from the internet. To say that I want to build here today on some of the work that I did in the queer art of failure on counterintuitive forms of knowing. So I'm going to do two things today. In the first part of the paper, I'm going to talk about that blog piece that Katie mentioned, a little blog that I wrote this summer that went viral, which is a really weird thing for academics when you write a blog, you know, maybe like, if you're lucky, 200 people read it, and you're like, wow, you know, oh, wow, 250 today, that's amazing. And they're probably mostly friends and family, right? So it was really interesting to write something that circulated really, really quickly and had something like 200,000 views in 3 days. And what that means is that you get a lot of hate mail, So I'm going to tell you about the blog and amplify some of the claims that I made there. And then in the second half of the paper, I want to present to you what I consider to be a lost classic of queer cinema that seems to open onto a scene of unlearning that is so profoundly different from the ways in which we think about queerness and knowing and being in a contemporary visual regime, that it seems as if there's a kind of unlearning that we have done in relationship to this forgotten past. Okay? So that's kind of where we want to go. But I'll begin, as Michael and Eamon did, with some propositions about learning and unlearning. So I have some questions to begin with. And they're not particularly articulate, but they're to just sort of guide us on the way. So the question is, here, can we unlearn political idioms and structures of knowing that currently keep us locked into our own private systems of pain and pleasure, and simultaneously prevent us from seeing the potential and even the rightness of other systems of sharing and co-experiencing? So when and why did learning become so profoundly individualized as opposed to collaborative, for example? And here I'm thinking of the work of Harney and Moten in the Undercommons, where Harney and Moten talk about something called study. Study is not the same as learning or being in relationship to a school teacher. In fact, study, they give this great example. Study is what happens often before the professor comes into the room and calls the room to order, right? So they give this example of when, before somebody enters to teach a class, something is happening in that classroom, right? And the call to order is where supposedly teaching begins. But what if we understood study to be something that precedes the professor's call to order, okay? So could we create, for example, at this conference, rather than a scene of learning and exchange, a dynamic and an atmosphere of study? Study where there isn't a pre-configured destination, there is an outcome that we are working towards. Study as something that happens, as we've been hearing, in surprising and unpredictable ways, and along the lines of what Harney and Moten call being with and for others, as opposed to, I don't know, being there to induce learning in others. So what if we think outside of the model of the individual to consider different models of pedagogy? Second, can we deploy some different strategies of articulation within critical thinking to extend and stretch our communications beyond the explicative, and this is obviously a citation of Rancière, and away from the performance of diagnosis. In other words, not what is wrong and why, but is what is right and how. And here also, I think I'm trying to say that we stick with certain emotive and affective registers in academia that, by the way, are not particularly effective when it comes to learning, right? So there's a lot of monotony would be one affective register. I mean, it seems to be an absence of affect, but it's also an affect. There's a lot of one-notedness in academia. What if we had instead something like passion, you know, something that you actually don't see that very often, despite the fact that professors very often are passionately attached to the things that they're teaching. So why have we settled for a very narrow range of affective registers when in fact there are multiple registers available to us that we should be using because they're more effective in terms of communication? And the one that I particularly like is comedy, which is seen as a very dubious and suspicious register, but despite that, I will give you lots of Monty Python references still to come, so stay tuned. But I mean, after all, what we're after here is some sort of engaged, inspired, emancipated mode of interaction. Therefore, we will have to expand this affective register and learn potentially new ones. Third, this is thinking along with Rancière and the emancipated spectator. If the spectator must not expect to be enlightened by an aesthetic text, and the artist must not seek to teach the audience what he presumes they don't know, then how do we actually stage what Rancière calls an intellectual adventure? And I love this term. I mean, I think that that's probably why people go into teaching, education, academia, is precisely to have intellectual adventures, and I'm willing to propose that we rarely actually have them, or even stage them for each other. So what would it mean to agree to go on an intellectual adventure together, an adventure that would allow for surprise, unanticipated outcomes, and unpredictable effects? Okay. So that's just by way of a sort of a framework for what I'm going to present to you. And this first section, A Path So Twisted, and if you read my little abstract, you know that these section headings come from Patti Smith's song, Pissing in the River. Path So Twisted and Defeated and Gifted is the second piece of it. And Pissing in the River is the theme song for Times Square, the film that I'm going to show you later on. And it's also a quote, really, that she's taken from William Blake. Blake says, "Improvement makes straight roads, but the crooked roads without improvement are roads of genius." So I want to set out on one of these crooked roads and refuse this idea that education in some way is linked to improvement, to the straight road that takes you from one place to the other. We're going to go on some sort of weird, twisted, and hopefully perverse path, and perverse not in a Zizhakian sense. Just had to get that in there. I don't know why Zizhak is suddenly the perverted note. It doesn't seem very perverted to me, but I promise real perversion. So here we go. So let's start then by thinking about this blog. I don't know if I'm not going to presume that any of you were among the people who read it, so I will tell you a little bit about the blog post. And it was really short. It was 4 pages. But I didn't, and it seems like it was dashed off, but I actually did take a lot of care in writing it because I knew that I was making some controversial statements in it, and I wanted to get the frame exactly right. So I had just this summer been to a conference that was queer-friendly, performance studies-oriented, very aware of all of the different politics of identity that one would want a conference to be aware of. And yet it was punctuated by one protest after another, by people who felt that this had not been addressed, or that had not been addressed, or their particular identitarian concerns had been overlooked, or had been in some way offended or offensively addressed, right? So after 3 days of seeing amazing performances, we suddenly hit this wall, and we went into a series of basically negotiations, almost legalistic negotiations about who should apologize to whom, about what, whether someone should have been warned about something, the content of this and that, the trigger warnings should have been instituted. And I'm going to presume that you know something about trigger warnings. Is that true? A trigger warning, trigger warnings basically developed on the internet to let people know as they're clicking through content. Warning, when you click this kind of material might come up. It could be explicit, it could be violent, it could have sexual violence embedded in it, and it could be triggering, as in it might not be what you want flashing up on your screen, or it might put you in relationship to material that you consciously avoid when you're making choices and in your cruising on the internet, okay? So that's the context in which trigger warnings develop. But by earlier this year, at least one liberal arts college in the US, Oberlin, had decided that the students called for professors to start using trigger warnings on their syllabi. And it's this move from the internet to the classroom, and also in many ways to people are now asking for trigger warnings in relationship to all visual material, that I want to contest. And there's actually even a little clip from from the film that I'm going to show you that probably should have a trigger warning, which I will not give. But I didn't say for what, so you'll just have to see whether you're triggered by it or not. So I wrote this piece, and I'll tell you the 5 claims that I made, but it went viral, and that means that basically everyone who likes it hits like, fine, and everyone who doesn't writes you a long letter telling you what an asshole you are, which was interesting. And it was interesting that a piece that was contesting the way in which people want to be warned about violent material basically produced an incredibly violent response, most of which was directed at me. And I had things that came close to death threats from former students, okay? So that was interesting. I thought, well, okay, hit a nerve, and let's see what comes out of it. So let me just unpack in more detail then the claims that I was making in this blog post, so that if people want to, throw things at me, then they can do so. So first of all, I did, and there was a lot of Monty Python. That just, because the first thing was that I had just gone to see Monty Python on the Holy Grail, and there were so many moments where I thought, oh my God, I don't know if you could say that now. There's a lot of that, or even think of The Life of Brian, which ends with, Brian, the mistaken Messiah, singing always look on the bright side of life while hanging on the cross. I mean, it's in the climate of, theocratic USA, I don't know if you could show that film today as a contemporary film and get away with it. So that was sort of an interesting marker of how quickly things have shifted in relationship to the permissible, let's say, in terms of comedy. Okay, so I have 5 points that I want to make. First of all, just to say that I take exception strongly and vehemently to the idea that students require trigger warnings from their professors, that audiences should receive them from artists, or that anyone should ask to be potentially protected from potentially wounding course materials or aesthetic content. In the context of a conference on the Pedagogics of Unlearning, you would have to say that unlearning, which is what we're here to do, cannot happen in the presence of trigger warnings. There cannot be an advance warning for learning or unlearning. To the extent that you give an advance warning, you, in a way, are prepping people to not encounter the new. You are predicting, telegraphing, you are laying out the ground before you actually find a way to deliver it in a surprising format that might allow it to be absorbed and internalized in some way. So, and furthermore, learning, it seems to me, most people who've ever been in a classroom at some point have had to encounter the fact that learning should and does make us uncomfortable. To the extent that teaching occurs, people will be uncomfortable. If everyone's just completely blasé and fine with what's going on, they may not, in fact, be engaged in the way that one is seeking to engage. So trigger warnings, as they developed online, have not made a very helpful transition to these other scenarios, like the classroom. So second, this idea that the way that the trigger warnings have been taken up in the US and the way that they played out at the conference I was at is the idea that some people have trauma that is so present to them and so available just below the surface that poorly presented material could easily trigger them in a way that would be deeply distressing for them. Okay, there are a couple of problems with that. One, the idea that only some people in a room have trauma is already a problem. I mean, if we were going to give warnings for trauma, we would have to find out every single person's trauma in the room, and it seems very wrong to presume that anyone would come into the room without some moment of trauma that potentially could be triggered by some material. Okay, so that's first of all, the idea that there are privileged subjects suddenly of trauma. And I'm not saying that trauma is evenly distributed across a population by any means. It is not. And it absolutely varies by, for example, race and class as being markers that will deeply influence the distribution of trauma. But at the same time, the presumption of a non-traumatized subject seems to me to be a misreading of subjectivity. You know, I mean, even if you just go back to Lacan and understand the meaning of the idea that lack is at the very heart of subjectivity, then it would be futile to imagine a subject that is formed around something like, untraumatized psychologies. But second, in relationship to this claim, the trigger warning presumes that what will trigger you is a repetition of the same. So let's say your trauma is sexual violence, okay? The presumption is that a representation of sexual violence will trigger you. But that's not how trauma works, right? Trauma is material that is taken into, I mean, in some understandings of trauma, what the self can't bear any longer to be in relationship to, it gets either buried or pushed down into other realms of consciousness where it can be held without being experienced over and over again. So the trigger is something unexpected that steps, without warning upon that area where the trauma is stored, right? So it isn't the case that simply the representation of the original traumatizing event would trigger you. It might give you memories, and it might remind you, but that's not the same as being triggered. Nothing in anyone's training around psychoanalysis would allow for that kind of reading of trauma, that it is simply representation of the same thing that then causes the re-experience of the trauma. But third, I don't know where I am in the numbers, it doesn't matter. The other thing to consider here is that what we think of as triggering material in these contexts is very selective, okay? So let me give an example. I was teaching a class on the Holocaust and representations of catastrophe. So I taught, this was 3 years ago, I taught Night and Fog as the sort of opening gambit. And I said a little bit about La Tournée, about the use of original documentary footage, and about the relationship between sound and image, and played the film. People walked out, people came up to me afterwards, asked me why I didn't give a warning about the material in the film. And I'm like, you're in a course on the Holocaust, okay? I cannot warn you adequately for what is to come. So if you need a warning when the name of the class is the Holocaust, the politics of catastrophe, then maybe we don't share an understanding of what we mean by Holocaust here, right? But the other piece of it was, a few weeks later, I showed Triumph of the Will, just a clip from Triumph of the Will. It was, there were a couple of clips that I showed, the one of the plane coming in, and you see the Aryan faces looking up, and then the faces looking up at the Führer, and then the final speech at the end of the film. People were entranced, wanted to watch more, okay? I'm like, okay, so this film actually should have had a trigger warning, which is warning seduction to the principles of fascism at play in this visual material that if you're not aware of, this is Susan Sontag's point in Fascinating Fascism, watch carefully because this is a seductive document that seduces even as it represents. That should have a warning, in my opinion. That did not need a warning according to the students who couldn't rewatch the whole film, right? So this idea that we know already what is traumatic material and what requires protection, I would say let's be very careful when we show Triumph of the Will. I would show Night and Fog all the time, in any class in some ways, because of the kind of work that it does and the presumptions that it does not make about the relationship between the spectator and the visual. And this is where we might go to Ranciere's chapter in The Emancipated Spectator about the intolerable image. Ranciere reminds us there that basically visuality depends upon conditions of visibility. And so precisely what is intolerable cannot be predicted in advance, cancelled ahead of time, or subjected to legalistic trials to determine whether or not it is necessary to view this or that scene of pain, destruction, or violence. For Rancière, the issue of visibility itself must undergo a displacement, and he writes, quote, "The issue is not whether it is necessary to show the horrors suffered by the victims of some particular violence. It revolves around the construction of the victim as an element in a certain distribution of the visible." And I think that that's a much richer, more complicated way of thinking about visual terrain as this distribution, maybe, of sensation and affect, a distribution that is in no way, the same for everyone, but that is determined by conditions of visibility as opposed to an absolute. This is absolutely something that requires a warning. This is not. This idea takes us out of a mode of judging whether something is a positive or a negative image, tolerable or intolerable. These kinds of judgments, it seems to me, have no place in our interaction with the visual. Okay. Third, I was asking whether this is something to do with a particular historical moment, that in this era when we have gay marriage, we have increased visibility of gay, lesbian, and trans subjects. There are ongoing conversations about bullying in schools and workplaces, right? Why at that moment do we see a generation of gay, lesbian, and trans people articulating themselves through trauma? It's just a question, right? And I don't know the answer to it. Why, at the end of this particular neoliberal instantiation of rights and protections for gay, lesbian, trans people, why at that moment do we have gay, lesbian, trans youth groups within which people articulate and identify themselves through trauma? And that, it seems to me, is also connected to what I'm going to call a coloniality of the present, a reading of all materials from the past through a very narrow lens of current conditions. And I'll give you the example. So the conference I was at, there was a play staged by a Mexican, lesbian, indigenous activist playwright about a case of a 17th century hermaphrodite who was accused of raping another woman. That was the premise of the play. She was accused of raping another woman with her very large clitoris. So rather than undergo the trial and possibly be hung for this obscene act, she chose to undergo surgery to have her clitoris removed so that the court of law could not accuse her of this crime. That's what the play was about. So there were scenes that were set actually in a kind of humorous way about surgery on this hermaphroditic body. The protest afterwards was that this was violence against trans people, that the play was representing violence against trans people and encouraging audiences to laugh about surgeries that were conducted on trans bodies. So this is where I want to say something about the coloniality of the present. This is not a transgender body. It's a 17th century hermaphroditic body, which is not the same as a trans body. The surgery that would have been carried out on this, and this is an actual historical case, the surgery that would have been carried out is not the same as sex reassignment surgery, nor was its purpose sex reassignment. So this collapsing of past and present in order to then take offense and say this play wounds me as a trans person constitutes what I would call a coloniality of the present, where everything has to be read only through this very, very contemporary framework, and nothing can stand in its own historical condition of visibility. Did I only have 3? No? Okay. So number 4, one of the other terrains that was sort of animating this discussion around trigger warnings was a set of debates within gay, lesbian, trans communities about the use of the word tranny. Tranny is an interesting word. Tranny is not the same as faggot or dyke. It is actually not a hate speech word. Tranny is a word of affection, as even the diminutive form suggests, tranny, that was developed within transgender communities so as not to use the medicalized terminology of transsexual. So in the 1970s, people began to use this word tranny, and you can see it being used in some queer magazines, journals, zines. There were zines that used the term tranny as their title, and so on. This year, in this climate, at this moment, a group of trans activists in San Francisco asked a nightclub to stop calling itself Tranny Shack. Tranny Shack. Tranny Shack's been around for like 15 years and was one of the first places to announce itself as a nightclub venue for trans people and their partners. Okay? So what does it mean to ask that club that actually pioneered making space for trans people to say to that club, this is offensive to trans people that you are using this term in your title, Tranny Shack. Okay? And indeed, the owner of the club changed the name to T-Shack and was made a Grand Marshal in the queer parade for her troubles. Okay. So I want to, really contest this idea of offensive speech and say that there are differences between all kinds of moments of uses of slang, and that slang has its place, because after all, slang is the naming of people who are outside of the norm. And queer studies in particular has been very engaged in reconstituting terms that are being used as an insult. The term queer itself is an insulting word that had basically, the politics of reclaiming it are to say, that's right, I am queer. I am not like you. I am not committed to the normative. I like the oddness that my identity seems to frame, and I own it, right? Tranny is saying the same kind of thing. When we get to Times Square, you'll see an entire scene that is about claiming these terms of, that seem to be terms of abuse, that get re-signified in the context of a queer punk engagement. Okay, and then my last point was simply what happened to humor. I thought my piece was funny. Okay, maybe it wasn't that funny, but it had little moments of humor in it, and a lot of Monty Python, which tends to be, I thought, a universal, all right, not universal, but at least European and somewhat American shorthand for humor. And to that end, then, I'm actually going to show you a scene from The Life of Brian to try to get at what humor can do that seriousness cannot. And seriousness, I think anyway, is it's a sort of arrogant academic mode, a sort of self-authorizing mode to the extent that one's topic is serious, that no other claim needs to be made for it. If you're writing about death, you now don't have to say why you're writing about death. If you're writing about cartoons, as I do, you often have to give a 10-minute preamble as to why Finding Nemo is an important text. And I won't take you through that, but I could. So let me show you a clip from The Life of Brian that I believe articulates a project for transgender politics that is way in advance to that whole activist moment of banning the word tranny. And that actually connects transgender politics to a politics of anti-imperialism. I know it sounds like it wouldn't, but it will. Oh, we do not have sound, somehow. We had sound earlier, so can make sure, and the sound there.
I do feel right that any anti-imperialist group like ours must reflect such a divergence of interest within its power base.
Agreed, Francis? Yeah, I think Judy's point of view is very valid, Fred, provided the movement never forgets that it is the inalienable right of every man or woman to rid himself or herself. Agreed. Thank you, brother, or sister. Where was I? I think you finished. Oh, right. Furthermore, it is the birthright of every man or woman. Why don't you shut up about women, Stan? You're putting us off. Women have a perfect right to play a part in our movement, Reg. Why are you always on about women, Stan? I want to be one. What? I want to be a woman. From now on, I want you all to call me Loretta. What? It's my right as a man.
Well, why do you want to be Loretta, Stan?
I want to have babies. You want to have babies? It's every man's right to have babies if he wants them. But you can't have babies. done to oppress me? I'm oppressing you, Stan. I've got a womb. Where's the fetus going to gestate? You're going to keep it in a box?
Here, I've got an idea. Suppose you agree that you can't actually have babies, not having a womb, which is nobody's fault, not even the Romans, but that you can have the right to have babies.
Good idea, Judith. We shall fight the oppressors for your right to have babies, brother. Sister, sorry. What's the point? Well, what's the point of fighting for his right to have babies when he can't have babies? It is symbolic of our struggle against oppression. Symbolic of his struggle against reality.
Alright, so there's a lot happening there. It's a very Python-esque scene in that it plays out the art of interruption, right? And you know, the Monty Python line is now for something completely different, which seems to me encapsulates beautifully the pedagogics of unlearning anyway. But the interruption turns out not to be simply a detour, but is the articulation of another kind of politics that they eventually actually decide to go with. So let's see how this works. So you have the Popular Front of Judea. The leadership is trying to decide how to organize in the face of imperialist brutality. And then you get this moment of interruption where Stan announces that he is actually Loretta and wants to fight for his right to bear children. Loretta claims that it is her right as a man to have babies, and that Reg is oppressing her by denying her this right. While the triggered response to this text might claim that it makes light of the experience of transgender women, the emancipated spectator's reading could open the sequence up to a new rendering of transgenderism as a desire for forms of embodiment that are necessarily impossible and deeply desired all at once. So it's the impossibility of the embodiment and the right to that impossible desire that the clip is articulating. Just because Loretta's sex reassignment will never allow her to have babies, the People's Front of Judea affirms her right to fight for the right to have babies. Why? Because this demand for the impossible symbolizes the anti-imperial struggle to which they have all committed. And so you can see that it's this twisted path, this counterintuitive path, this path that doesn't follow the logic of making demands that can be met, so much more an Occupy logic of refusing to make demands or making demands that are impossible to meet, that constitutes the kind of politics that I want to argue for here. Okay, so my last section then comes from, it is about this film that seems to take up the challenges that I'm saying we should return to, and that we can find articulated in a film from 1980 much better than any queer film made in the last few years. And I couldn't find it. Let me just say, first of all, the reason that this film, Times Square, is lost is because there are only two 35mm reels of it that remain. You can find a bad copy on DVD, and there are 3 clips on YouTube too, the clips that I have here for you today. It's almost never shown in film festivals. And it is an amazing film with a punk soundtrack from 1980, whose climactic scene has the butch protagonist just going on a sort of bend of destroying things to Patti Smith's Pissing in the River. And I can't find that clip to show you. So instead, I give you the Patti Smith lyrics as a kind of frame for thinking with and through this film. So there's the poster for it, one of the posters. And let me give you the plot summary, tell you a little bit about it, and then I'll just show you. I've got 3 clips to show you, 3 clips that are available on YouTube that I will play for you. So 2 young girls, 17-year-olds, Nikki and Pammy, meet in a psychiatric ward of a hospital in New York. Pammy is a poor little rich girl. She's played by a Puerto Rican actress, Trini Alvarado, who went on to have a few other roles and is a really powerful actress. And she has been placed in the psych ward by her rich father, who's running for mayor of New York, on a kind of Giuliani lifestyle platform. He wants to clean up Times Square and he keeps citing his daughter as his alibi. He wants to clean up Times Square so that his daughter can walk unmolested through its streets. So Pammy's put in a room with Nikki, who's basically been abandoned by her mother, is a street kid, and he walks around holding a beatbox that plays the Ramones' I Want to Be Sedated. And they decide to get the hell out of that psych ward. They escape together, and we see their adventures as they go wild in Times Square. The relationship is explicitly lesbian, but the studio at the time cut out the lesbian scene. There was a very explicit lesbian scene in the middle. And because the two girls were 17 years old, and because at that point Robert Stigwood, who was the producer, who also was the guy who produced Saturday Night Fever, wanted to deliver this film to the same audiences who had seen Saturday Night Fever, he demanded that this scene be taken out. So we never see the lesbian scene, but it's very clear that this is a very charged, emotional, erotic relationship between the two girls. Problem is, when the scene was taken out, Alan Moyle, the director, decided that his masterpiece was ruined and he abandoned the film altogether. And so it languished and never found an audience. I saw it in 1987 at a queer film festival and never saw it again until this summer when I was asked to host a queer film event and I asked them to play this film. And there were people who are theorists and historians of gay and lesbian film at that event who have never seen this film, okay? So it's really a lost classic, and it's bubbling over with some of the material that I'm trying to get at here in relationship to offensiveness and the art of the insult and wildness and so on. So let me play you a clip just to give you the ambiance of the film. And Nikki and Pammy have now left the hospital and they are in Times Square, the very Times Square that Pammy's father wants to clean up, but the Times Square where Nikki lives. Now, let me say also, I mean, this is Times Square as you never see it now. You know, it's literally this other New York, and it's also populated by mostly people of color. So this is a very, you know, well-worn idiom that the girls are seen as being sort of out of place because they're two white girls walking through streets populated by people of color, but also Nikki's familiarity with the streets of New York puts her in relationship to an idiom of rebellion that is staged explicitly as black. The soundtrack, however, for this scene is Talking Heads' Life During Wartime.
Hey!
it's a great clip. There's a lot of moments like that in the film. You can tell it's made in another moment of cinema because there are a lot of long takes that don't necessarily do anything to advance the plot, right? It slowly unfolds. It's the atmosphere of the film as much as anything that it wants to sell you on. It isn't just a narrative. So like that sequence is, when you're watching it in the cinema, is this like pure joy. You're just watching the joy that the two girls have in being together and being in this uncleaned up neighborhood that they find much more conducive to their friendship than the psych ward where they met. And then, of course, there's the fact that Times Square is not, it's not the place for Broadway musical. It's a place where a B movie, it's not even a B movie, it's like a D movie, House of Psychotic Women is playing, and they're able to make a joke about the fact that they are the psychotic women that the film is about. Then they see Pammy's face because her father, the guy running for mayor, has announced her to be missing, and her face is on the side of a bus saying that she's missing. People should say if they see her. And they draw a mask onto the poster, and this becomes their signature when they become a punk band, that they wear these little masks, predicting the masking that is now so much a feature of political life, like Anonymous and some of the Occupy, but also the Zapatistas. There's this whole thing around masking and not simply being a notable individual, but becoming part of a group. The climactic scene of the film is when girls all convene in Times Square for a performance by these two who call themselves the Sleaze Sisters, and everyone wears garbage bags and these little masks. So it's making reference to a completely different understanding of collectivity. It resists this individualized, psychologized, traumatized understanding of the self formed through injury, and instead takes vulnerability as the occasion for making collectivity of a different kind. Not as an occasion to say how one has been hurt, but as an occasion to strike back against the various institutions that they claim are the author of this hurt. The film came out the same year as William Friedkin's Cruising, and William Friedkin's Cruising is, now seen as a sort of, masterpiece about this underworld, the leather world that gay men were engaged in right before the AIDS crisis. You've got James Franco recreating sex scenes that were cut out. God hopes that, he doesn't find Times Square and decides to recreate the sex scene that was cut out of Times Square. Please, James, don't do it. But it's made in that same understanding of queerness as being an underworld, a subculture formed around sex, community, and different kinds of exchanges of bodily fluid. In terms of this film, there's the posters for Cruising. And of course, there's a serial killer thing at the heart of Cruising. Here, the piece is that the girls have run away, and their underworld is this world of female punk. A lot of the tactics that the Sleaze Sisters engage in predict the Lesbian Avengers and act up. But remember, the film's made 1979, 1980, so it is pre-AIDS crisis. But its politics is sort of the politics that leads to these forms of active resistance. And I just want to show you a scene of their bonding that happens in the Chelsea Piers 56, where they make their home, which is now a big, huge corporate sports center and a golfing range. Pier 56 is literally now a golf range. So I want you to see what Pier 56 was and how they articulate their bond to one another in this scene, and then I'll play you a concluding scene and wrap up. This is also a sort of utopian scene in a Munozian sense.
Like a better. Hey, my boy. Come on, man. Never see. Why didn't I realize it before? God, I see it. Don't you realize this is it? This is the place. So you watch this. Hey, blood, and yours. Come
on, don't worry, I ain't gonna hurt you, just relax. See? That's all. Now, I want you to listen. You never feel like freaking. You get panicky, shaky, I want you to call my name. Just scream it. Scream it as loud as you can. You know, like this. Pammy! Pammy! Nikki! Lock it up. Nikki! Pammy! Nikki! Pammy! Nikki! Pammy!
So to me, this is actually a really moving scene where they recognize each other, they affirm each other in their displacedness. They are in this completely abandoned, ruined place that contains the garbage of New York City that they craft into something else. It's also utopian, as I'm saying, in a sort of Munozian sense, that it's looking out. They spend a lot of time in this warehouse looking out, saying, you know, there's a better world. This is a shitty world, but there's a better world out there. I know there is. We can find it together. By being together, we will make something better. But we're living in the world that followed. So we know that this better world is not to come, and that the utopian is right there. It's in those kinds of moments, and it stays there locked in this screaming affirmation that they provide for each other. The film itself was received as a really, really bad film. Janet Maslin said that the action is so false, the characters so unsympathetic and uninteresting, that after a while the music begins playing the only dominant role. David Demby excoriated the film, but Playboy gave it 2 bunnies, and this is why I read Playboy and not the New Yorker, okay? Playboy gave it 2 bunnies and described it as a triumph of sleaze over substance, which could be a sort of byline for what I'm after here. Sleaze over substance seems to me to be a motto we could make much of this weekend. So, my interest in the film lies in a couple of different arenas. First, its unrelenting commitment to rebellion and resistance. Second, the way in which it predicts certain disruptive forms of queer activism that later become a big part of ACT UP and Lesbian Avengers. And finally, for the glimpse it gives us of a queer past that is neither backwards, in Heather Love's terms, nor simply experimental, but instead registers as utopian in the way that the late Jose Munoz conceives of utopia. A horizon that beckons with possibility, and a time that by definition can never come, will never come. And so to that end, let me give you this final scene that I want to play for you that also speaks to a sort of utopian element, but articulates the utopian in the language of insult. Insults that these two basically charge Pammy's father with making, but that they want to claim, that they claim in the form of a punk song. And this punk song is a sort of love song to the Times Square that Samuel Delaney writes about so beautifully in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, a Times Square that was teeming with sexual underworlds, with the forgotten, the detritus of New York was abandoned there, and that was cleaned up in this massive lifestyle campaign carried out by Giuliani and successfully completed in the last decade of hyper-capitalist economic exploitation. So in this last scene, Nikki and Pammy play a punk song at a radio station where a creepy Tim Curry presides as this DJ who has become the champion of the Sleaze Sisters and wants them to win and is going to give them a voice and give them a microphone and send out every message that they have across the airwaves across New York City. So this is where they become a punk band and the intellectual adventure finds its twisted path.
Yes, Father dear. You want to make Times Square as cold as your icy eyes? Why do you want to punish people who aren't like you? Do you know at home I've heard you use these following words? Big, nigger, faggot, psycho. Well, I just want you to know your daughter is one. Big, nigger, faggot, oh, your daughter is one.
conclude then. Should I pursue a path so twisted? Should I crawl defeated and gifted? So sings poet Patti Smith in the film's climactic moment of rupture. Pissing in the River rejects the language of improvement and rejects the straight and narrow, preferring with Blake, one of her favorite poets, to take the path so twisted and the crooked road of genius. I propose that we think again about giving up on words like tranny or the words that they use here, and about losing the connections forged through dispossession and loss. In other words, the insult names the dispossession and creates a community of the dispossessed that we should be claiming rather than rejecting. These bonds, as Christina Hanhart's work in Safe Space shows, allowed queers in the 1970s to understand their political struggles as part and parcel of a more thoroughgoing critique of economic and racial policies. Once these politics gave way to an anti-violence and pro-gentrification gay agenda in San Francisco's Castro district, LA's West Hollywood, and New York City's Times Square, we lost the ability to imagine these different struggles as part of each other's fabric, as twisted or braided together through a shared sense of disaffection, abjection, refusal, and anger. Instead of trying to get this sense of a multi-directional politics back by creating checklists of political goals and identities, and by snapping our fingers and applauding when we hear the right words and phrases, we might want to return